All around us, the winners in our highly inequitable status quo declare themselves partisans of change. They know the problem and they want to be part of the solution. Actually, they want to lead the search for solutions. They believe that their solutions deserve to be at the forefront of social change. They may join or support movements initiated by ordinary people looking to fix aspects of their society. More often, though, these elites start initiatives of their own, taking on social change as though it were just another stock in their portfolio or corporation to restructure. Because they are in charge of these attempts at social change, the attempts naturally reflect their biases. The initiatives are mostly aren't democratic, nor do they reflect collective problem solving or universal solutions. Rather, they favor the use of the private sector and its charitable spoils, the market way of looking at things, and the bypassing of government. They reflect a highly influential view that the winner of an unjust status quo and the tools and the mentalities and values that help them win are the secret to redressing the injustices. Those at the greatest risk of being resented in an age of inequality are thereby recast as our saviors from an age of inequality.
Summit at Sea was a 4-day long maritime bacchanal honoring the credo of using business to change the world, and perhaps of using changing the world to prosper in business. It brought together a great many entrepreneurs and financiers who invest in entrepreneurs, some artists and yoga teachers to keep things interesting and healthy, and various others who tend to run in those circles and whose bios refer to them using terms like influencer, thought leader, curator, convener, connector, and community manager. Once you believe that business is how you change things these days, a conference of entrepreneurs offers unlimited possibilities. Indeed, many boarding the ship had recently received an inspirational message from one of the conference's organizers that framed Summit's mission in world historical terms. The winds are picking up in the east, and in 6 short days, something transformational is going to be born from the sky and the moon, and it might just change history. We may not see the full effect now, but that's the case with any great shift in culture, any great seismic shift amongst the plates of planet Earth.
For a long time, as I wrote this book, I grappled with the strangeness of indicting the practices and beliefs of a group of people among whom I have many friends. I felt an instantaneous recognition when I came upon an old phrase from the poet Czesław Milosz. In 1953, he published a book called The Captive Mind about his dismay at so many of his fellow Polish thinkers succumbing one rationalization and excuse at a time to the hypocrisies and repressions of Stalinism. He described his book as a debate with those of my friends who were yielding, little by little, to the magic influence of the new faith. That helped me greatly, for my book too is, among other things, a debate with my friends. It is a letter written with love and concern to people whom I see yielding to a new faith, many of whom I know to be decent. Of course, it is also a letter to the public, urging them to reclaim world changing from those who have co opted it.
If anyone truly believes the same ski town conferences and fellowship programs, the same politicians and policies, the same entrepreneurs and small and social businesses, the same campaign donors, the same thought leaders, the same consulting firms and protocols, the same philanthropist and reformed Goldman Sachs executives, the same win-wins and doing well by doing good initiatives, and private solutions to public problems that had promised grandly, if superficially, to change the world. If anyone thinks the market world complex of people and institutions and ideas that failed to prevent this mess, even as it harped on making a difference, and whose neglect fueled populism's flames is also the solution. Wake them up by tapping them gently with this book. For the inescapable answer to the overwhelming question, where do we go from here, is somewhere other than where we have been going, led by people other than the people who have been leading us.
Good evening, everybody. That was a few excerpts from the book by the author's friends and family. Today we welcome Anand Giridharadas back to Politics and Prose for his latest book, Winners Take All. Anand is a former McKinsey analyst, an Aspen Institute fellow, and author previously of The True American, argues in his new book that we shouldn't entrust the common good to an unelected set of elites, but need to look to our public institutions instead. That true change can't rely on charity with strings attached, but must come through decency, democracy, and people working together. As a journalist and in some ways a swamp creature myself, with friends who work for organizations mentioned in this book, I can tell you it provides a critical self-examining lens on many of the prominent idealistic players and organizations that run this town. He delves into the subject that strikes almost too close to home for many in DC, the, at times, he says, hypocritical charade of changing the world. Giriharadas' book is a bracing call to action that starts with a plea to the global elite to practice followership rather than leadership and simply stay out of the way of those trying to resolve the problems the wealthy have in many cases caused and are likely to perpetuate. Tonight, he will be joined in conversation by David Leonhardt, op-ed columnist and associate editorial page editor at the New York Times. Mr. Leonhardt has also served as Washington bureau chief and wrote The Economic Scene, a weekly economics column for the business section. In some ways tangentially related to the topic of this book, in 2005 he was one of the reporters who produced Class Matters, the paper's serial on social class in the United States, and he was part of a team of Times reporters whose coverage of corporate scandals was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2003. Please welcome me in joining Anand and David.
Thank you all. Thank you, Nihal. I'm pretty sure that sets a record for the two most difficult last names to pronounce ever at a Politics and Prose event.
Don't try to get in on that. I mean, that's just totally my territory.
That's fair.
When it comes to difficult last names.
Maybe someone can come help. This microphone's a little taut. Thank you. Thank you all for showing up. What a turnout. Well, we actually had not met until 10 minutes ago, despite
Correct.
sharing a New York Times history.
We've met online, which is the way you do it now.
Tweeted at each other. Yeah,
correct.
And yet, when Anand asked me to come do this, I was really excited because this is an important book, and it's an important book because it's an original book and it's an uncomfortable book for many of us. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, to asking you a bunch of questions. We're going to leave time at the end for all of your questions. I'm just going to ever so briefly set the scene for why I think this book is so important. So to me, the central problem of our age is the stagnation of living standards for the masses of American people. It's a problem in its own right. Many Americans aren't living much longer than their parents did. They aren't healthier than their parents were. They aren't wealthier than their parents were. They aren't more educated than their parents were. And that is deeply unusual for a modern society. I'm going to quote the book right now. There is one really wonderful sentence that makes this point. A successful society is a progress machine, which is absolutely true. And our society has not been a progress machine. Not only is it a problem in its own right, but it feeds essentially every other problem. As we have learned all too well over the last few years, it feeds racism, both here and in Europe. It makes it harder to solve our other problems like climate change. And so while we are talking about an argument here that is sharp and original and something that we haven't debated, I think it's just as important, in addition to acknowledging the originality of the argument, to think about just how important this is, because it connects really to the biggest topic that there is out there in society. And so you all didn't come to hear me. You came to hear him. So let's get to it. What led you to write this book? It's a fascinating story.
Is this on?
Yeah.
There is a are kind of two things that intersected: a personal experience and an observation of the society. First, I just want to say thank you all for being here. This is like a crazy crowd, and this is my hometown. My parents are here. So many old friends are here, and it's just such a pleasure to be here. And thank you for doing this. The intersection of an observation and an experience. The observation was, much as you say, a sense that the American dream was dying. And I think this was particularly stark for me because I was a foreign correspondent for the Times in India, and I moved back here in 2009, right as that story really got even worse. And a simple way to summarize the story that I had told in India for 4.5 years was the American dream coming to India. And when I got back here, I did a book on India, and Jon Stewart, in his elegant, brilliant way, actually captured the kind of thesis of my life. He said, so basically you're saying the American dream is alive and well, but only in India. And that kind of summarizes what I've been doing for the last 12 years. Like, that's true. But what struck me was that this country was not devoid of innovation. It wasn't devoid of great companies. It wasn't devoid of money. It wasn't devoid of forward motion. It's just that when the future rained on America, the very few harvested all the rainwater. There was a lot of future, just not enough to go around, or it was being hoarded. So that was kind of the one observation. The other observation was we also live in this age of historic generosity. Every elite graduate wants to change the world and is in Africa or has a social enterprise that recycles poop into coffee or whatever. And, the 184 people have signed the Giving Pledge. More, $410 billion given away last year, the year before, which is starting to approach the amount of non-military, discretionary government spending, right? We also have a parallel fourth branch of government of just rich people deciding what to do. So an age of generosity, an age that, as you say, has been utterly punishing to regular people. How do you square those? And is it just that the generosity isn't working fast enough, or is the generosity part of what is actually sustaining the cruelty? And that was the question. The personal experience was, and there's some folks here today who had this experience with me. I see one of them. I was invited in to this benevolent secret society called the Aspen Institute to be a fellow. And it's this really wonderful place that brings people together to talk about all kinds of issues. And I was brought into a fellowship that was about taking business people and getting them to step up, dream bigger, solve some of these social problems. And part of the theory is, which is a theory that I actually don't agree with, but the problems these days are too big and complicated for government to solve, that entrepreneurs need to kind of step up. And this is one of these programs that tries to groom entrepreneurs to do so. And the program was lovely. I bonded with my classmates, one of whom's over there, and we had a great time. But as I got deeper into this Aspen world and went to the Aspen Ideas Festival, which some of you may have gone to, and got my umbrella sponsored by Monsanto and the Pepsi booth, and had conversations in the Coke seminar building, not the drink, but the brother, about making the world a better place, and and Goldman Sachs was sponsoring our summer reunion, and it started to feel like when rich and powerful people get together in Aspen to talk about making the world a better place, number one, they're not succeeding because of all the numbers you talked about, and number two, they may be part of what is upholding a system that they actually refuse to change, but make gestures toward changing in order to not have to change it. And I started to realize that a lot of these things that seem good in our time, social enterprise, big philanthropy, doing good by doing well, win-win this, win-win that there was this whole rhetoric that was actually about the rich and powerful changing the world in ways that didn't require their world to change, making a difference in ways that protected their right to keep making a killing, that allowed them to give without having to take less, that allowed them to do more good without having to stop doing the harm that they were doing by not paying people enough at their companies, by building predatory monopolies in Silicon Valley, by having business models in private equity that were based on stripping value out of pensions and American workers' paychecks. And that you had this entire complex of essentially using apparent kindness to launder a crappy economy. And I began to investigate it, and I have no friends left.
So connect the dots for us, right? You lay out two scenarios. One scenario is these efforts to improve the world just aren't sufficient to the problem, right? They're a rounding error.
Drop in the bucket.
Drop in the bucket. The other is actually they are protecting the people doing them in some direct or indirect ways from having to take less. Can you tell me why you think the evidence is that it's the second? What do we see in our society that makes you think it's really the second one?
Okay, so let's take an example that I think in many of our worlds, and I know in this city is a big example. So I think we all have a sense that if mobility is suffering the way it is in America, education is one issue where a lot of people think like that if you could pick one issue, that's a place where you could really make a lot of difference, right? Public education. A lot of people work on that issue. I would say in many of these circles, that's probably the plurality in terms of like when people want to take on something, that's a place they go. What do people do in these elite spheres when they take on that issue? And this city is a very prime example of that. They create charter schools often, right? Now, is there anything bad about creating a charter school? No. Is that charter? Well, that's a whole different issue. But like at the margin, don't worry, I'm coming there. I'm getting there. Don't worry. This train is definitely coming to that station. Are there kids in that neighborhood who are better off because you did that than if you didn't? Of course. At the margin, it's always better, right? There are very few of these programs I write about that actually are actually hurting people at the margin. Like people are helped, lives are saved. But why is it that they like charter schools? Why is it that, in New York City, people who live in Greenwich commute to New York for their hedge fund, perhaps contributed to the housing crisis that cost a lot of people their homes, then adopt like one charter school in Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn and tell all their friends that they helped 3 black boys go to Yale? Why? Why are they doing that? What do they not want to happen? Equally funded public schools for everybody. Do you ever hear any rich people talk about that issue? Great. Do you ever hear people talking about actually why is it that Chevy Chase has better public schools than any other district in America? Why is that? I certainly can't explain it to a 6-year-old. Why mommy and daddy's home value is the basis for the quality of their education. It's a system that we all know none of us could defend, but we all. There are people fighting cases on this issue, but in general, when elites take on the issue of education, they take it on in a way that protects their right to keep living as they do. So what's the evidence that the generosity is upholding the thing? If you do the charter school, right, you create enough of a sense things are being taken care of. You can kind of dampen the public's anger. People, we're on it, we're helping. And what you can do is you can actually soften the pressure to do actually justice. And a lot of what I write about in the book is acts of generosity that seek to masquerade as justice. But generosity and justice are not the same.
I don't want to take us down into education. Anyone's welcome to ask about it because I want to keep on the themes of the book. How much of this do you think is witting? How much of this do you think, on some sense, is strategic? And how much of this is naivete or something more innocent?
It's a great question. It's something I thought about a lot. So I spent time, I want to convey to you, like, this is a book, and this is why we sort of had these readings to start. This is a book with ideas in it, but we're talking about the ideas, but this is really actually a book about people.
Let me echo that. This is a book of stories about human beings.
And it's all portraits of, 8 or 9 people who are actually struggling with the issues we're talking about tonight. So the book is not like me lecturing at you. It's actually these stories of people sitting in a limousine, sitting in a cruise ship conference, grappling with this stuff. As much as one can grapple in a cruise ship conference of entrepreneurs with yoga teachers. And they needed some gender balance. And so one of the things I found is that there's a spectrum in this kind of elite do-gooding, from the naive to the shrewd. I'm borrowing that phrase from Paulo Freire. The naive and the shrewd kind of can both end up participating in this. So let me give you the stereotypes of this. I mean, there's many variations of this, but the stereotype that I think we'd recognize. A lot of the finance people I know in New York are more on the shrewd end of the spectrum, right? So if you think about how Goldman Sachs does giving, GS gives, 10,000 women, green bonds, social impact, those kind of things. I think it's fairly clear what Goldman Sachs intends for the world. I think it's fairly clear that it is very motivated by money. It's not trying to make the world a better place as a primary goal. And that those giving activities are kind of lubricants in the engine of taking. I think that's reasonably obvious to us. And the people I know in candid moments will be fairly clear that they know that, and there's emails that surface during the financial crisis that make clear, like, ooh, bad story coming tomorrow about the mortgage thing, like, let's announce the giving thing, right? So I think there, it's like, that's the shrewd end of the spectrum. But one of the things I want to be really clear on is, I actually don't think that's the dominant tendency. And most of the people I write about in the book are not quite like that. I think I got a very good piece of advice as I was starting the book, that what would be most interesting is to understand how decent people uphold an indecent system. And the bridge between decent people and an indecent system is bad beliefs, is rationalizations, is excuses. And so this is a book about the excuses, what Piketty calls the apparatus of justification. And so on the naive end of the spectrum, the stereotype, but a really true one, is Silicon Valley. It is very, very different, in my experience, from Wall Street. Yeah, they maybe want their trillion-dollar valuations, but most of the people I spend time with there are actually, I think, genuinely motivated by something other than money. That doesn't actually make them any safer to me. It makes them a little more dangerous in certain ways. But I think they're sincere about trying to make the world a better place in a way that hedge fund people are often not. I think they have a vision and a theory of, if I can only do this, or if we could get every user on Facebook XYZ, and I think to actually understand them and maybe defang them, you actually have to understand the sincerity. But the sincerity becomes its own problem. We actually, this may sound counterintuitive, but I actually think as a society, we know what to do with straightforwardly greedy people. I mean, we screw up every now and then, but like, we think about Goldman, I mean, it's very regulated, SEC, like any weird trades before a major announcement, they're on it. Like, we miss things, but in general, we are all up in Goldman's grill. Silicon Valley, there's like, we don't even know where the grill is, right? And we basically don't regulate it. I mean, I sat with a US senator a year ago who said, I am probably the most anti-Facebook, like want to do the antitrust thing. I literally don't know. I'm a US senator of 100 people working for me. I can't get a clear answer on whether I have the authority to look into that question. And it's not his fault. Like, they have spent so much money lobbying to confuse that question that, and so that's the naive end of the spectrum. So I think you have a whole bunch of people who are using the idea of doing good in a very cynical way. But I think more often than not, you have people who have bought into a culture. And this book, in some ways, is an attempt to dismantle a culture, a set of ideas that I think are just phony ideas that I think if we could actually see through, the next time, like, what I want is for you to read this book, and the next time you hear win-win, to be like, yeah, right, instead of, wow, so cool, and the next time you hear thought leader, to be like, ugh, instead of like, ooh, sounds so smart, I actually think it's these very subtle things in language and culture. Like, is anyone here European, lives in Europe or from Europe? Okay. Does anybody in Europe think Mark Zuckerberg's changing the world? Correct. This is a cultural idea that we have. Like, Mark Zuckerberg is not responsible he's not solely responsible for the idea that Mark Zuckerberg is changing the world. There is enablement in the culture that makes us look at him that way, even those of us who don't like him. And in Europe, he's like a guy with a company that should probably be regulated in antitrust.
Let's talk in his book,
right.
Basically. Yeah. So I want to ask you about the opening character in your book, Hillary Cohen, who is a great example of a decent person. My guess is many people who read the book will be reminded of someone when they read her story. Maybe themselves, maybe their kid. In my case, it was my wife, who, when she got out of law school and she said she wanted to go work in nonprofit law, people said to her condescendingly, that's great, you just got to go to a firm first. Right? You can't go to nonprofit law. You got to learn the real hard stuff at a firm, which my wife did not do. But a lot of people feel that kind of pressure. So tell us the story of Hillary Cohen and about this whole kind of factory of what we do with young idealistic people.
Yeah. So one of the things that happened as I was writing the book, I did a lot of different reporting exercises, and there were moments in the 3-year journey where the book could have a kind of mean quality in certain parts of it. But mean can be kind of fun. And I was helped by my wife and my editor, and then a friend of mine named Casey Gerald, who has a great memoir coming out in October. And Casey said to me, you got to find the love in it. And so I actually had submitted the book. I took it back, threw out half of it, redid it, and Hillary's one of the new characters. She had like 2 pages before, and I actually realized her story. And the reason I started with Hillary is the way this culture starts is not with a billionaire with $50 billion to spend. The way this culture starts is when a senior in college is 21 or 22, maybe has debt, maybe doesn't, has big dreams of changing the world, is about to make that decision, pull the trigger on a future. Do you do this or do you do that? That's where it happens, right? And if you've been through that moment, you know what a fraught moment that is. So Hillary, but she really could be thousands of young graduates today, arrives at Georgetown in 2010, full of idealism, wanting to change the world. She wants to, she's very aware. I mean, this generation is like, the wokest generation ever. She's very aware of these issues of inequality. She's at Georgetown, so the new pope is like a big deal at Georgetown, and the fact that it's like this radical anti-inequality pope is a big deal. And Piketty's book lands in this time. Black Lives Matter is in this time. This is a time when the Tea Party, which is a kind of right-wing critique of this feeling of the American dream slipping away, that's at this time. So that discourse of inequality is everywhere. And she decides, I want to change the world. I want to change the lives of millions of people. And then the story of the chapter is how Hillary ends up at Goldman Sachs first and then McKinsey, fueled by that desire, and what happens to her that makes her make that choice, and then come to regret that choice, and then come to regret her regret. And the short answer is, these firms have done an amazing job of reaching down into campus and getting these kids when they're vulnerable, when they don't know what's ahead, when they're uncertain, and offering them certainty at moments when no one else is on the scene. Right? I don't know if this is true now, but I'm sure the New York Times doesn't have like campus information sessions.
It does not.
Correct? Right? It also doesn't like have that many jobs to offer. But I don't think legal aid has information sessions. There's a whole bunch of professions that just don't show up. And a handful of these firms show up. And what they've done is they offer a sense that you can change the world. They've sharpened their pitch. This is not what they used to do 20 years ago. But it's, change the world, improve lives, invent something. It's this kind of, and the pitch is actually that if you don't apprentice here, if you don't learn the Goldman way, one day you're going to be in Africa trying to help some people, and you're only going to be able to help 100 instead of 1 million because you don't know how to make a spreadsheet. And do you want that on your conscience? Because you were so hoity-toity about not working at Goldman Sachs. Now look at all these people dying because of your purism. That's not what they say, but that's the subliminal pitch. And Hillary really bought, and Hillary is like one of the most thoughtful. I mean, her other professional option was being a rabbi, right? She's probably the most thoughtful, like analytical person I've met of that generation. And she went to Goldman, didn't like that, went to McKinsey. Thought that was more for her. As soon as she got there, she realizes like totally fine place, but this is not like world changing. I'm like helping businesses save money, but that's not what I wanted to do. And she's about to quit, and she gets a phone call or an email or whatever it is these days, a Snapchat, saying, new project. President Obama is about to leave office. He's trying to revitalize democracy, move power back to the people in his post-presidential life, and he needs advice, so he's hiring McKinsey to advise him on how to hand power back to the people. And so now Hillary is like really confused. She's about to quit. And she thinks, well, if Barack Obama thinks that we should be redesigning democracy, maybe I'm in the right place. Maybe I don't know. And she said, it was the silencer of my doubts and the conjurer of many new doubts when he called. So she ended up working on that project, advising Barack Obama on how to revitalize democracy. And then she ended up leaving and kind of working for Obama directly. And then she even found that a little bit much, and she ended up going to Stanford and studying ethics and, kind of going back to the stuff she'd studied in college. But the story, as I've been touring, one of the things that's so interesting is, and I get letters, I'm now getting like 10 letters a day from college students and recent graduates talking about the crazy pressure they feel under to basically do these things that they don't want to do because they're told that they can't do any of the other things they do want to do if they don't do these things. And the last thing I want to say on that is, like, I actually, I spent a year plus as a very unillustrious McKinsey consultant. My father was a McKinsey consultant for many years, had a great career there, unlike me. Like, I think it's a totally fine institution, but I just think there's a lot of fine institutions that would be great grooming mechanisms. And every profession has a bunch of competencies that are useful. I think pilots, who are very good at managing risk and whatever, like, should we all be a pilot before we go help people? Maybe. Like, should we all learn espionage before we help people and figure out who you can trust? Like, I think journalists have very interesting skills. We listen to a lot of people and we kind of like figure out where the truth is in a mushy cloud of words. Like, every profession has interesting, useful skills. My only beef is how a couple of professions manage to convince all these young people that unless you learn those professions, you can't be a capable person in the modern world.
I do think some of it's pressure and the prestige they've built around themselves and that others, and I think some of it, as you suggested, is just lack of knowing what else kids could do, right? Other places don't show up and
Correct.
schedule interview sessions and all that.
Correct.
Last thing before I turn it over to everyone else, other end of the kind of power and experience spectrum. Let's imagine you could time travel and go back to 2001. Bill Clinton has gotten out of office. He's another character in your book. And instead of setting up the Clinton Global Initiative, what should he have done instead? And that's obviously a broader question, right?
Great
There
question.
are people with money and power and resources, and most don't have as much as Bill Clinton, but who do actually honestly want to make a difference, right? And don't want to do it as some sort of strategic way to protect their own advantages. What should those people do?
Correct. That's a great question. So let me deal with that in two parts. One, Bill Clinton, and second, what can people do? I reported from the last CGI that he did. The reason it was the last was they thought Hillary was going to win, so they couldn't keep having CGIs every year, but we know how that went. And so I reported from that, and then I spent 90 minutes with him about 6 months after the election. And we basically had a kind of contentious 90-minute argument about, and my curiosity was, in 1964, when he was at Georgetown, the book is kind of bookended by these two Georgetown students, Hillary Cohen now and Bill Clinton. When he was at Georgetown in 1964, who believed more than Bill Clinton in changing the world through politics, through movements, through policy, through real change that actually changes things at the root and for everybody, right? That guy could have had any opportunity on earth. He chose to go back to Arkansas, lose an election, like fight in those trenches, right? Today, who believes more than Bill Clinton in this alternate theory of change that I'm writing about, which is that you change the world through kind of plutocratic partnerships? And if you go to CGI, it's like Goldman Sachs and McDonald's will build 8 playgrounds with like a Canadian mining billionaire and some official from this labor department will supervise it, and Palantir will evaluate it, and he said at the final CGI, in one of his probably final speeches to the world in that kind of forum, he said, "This is all that works in the modern world. This is all that works in the modern world," right? Again, going back to the Aspen, there's part of this fantasy of problems are too big for government now, and so we had this argument about it, and so I guess to invert the argument is to answer your question, which is what could he have done? Well, I think given that what turned out to be the big issue in American life, which he knew was coming, was angry white working class people feeling mocked by the future because of demographic change and because of economic change. Who could have spoken to them better? Who could have built movements? Who could have actually, tried to affect policy and tell us that, all the rich splaining that happened about trade benefiting everybody, that was just wrong. Everybody, like all the think tanks in Washington that just kept lecturing people in America that what they were experiencing, they were not actually experiencing. Trade was working for everybody. Tom Friedman's world was succeeding and globalization was working and working. Well, Bill Clinton could have called BS on that. He could have traveled around this country. He could have actually worked politically, even as a former president. And the place that we had this weird argument about was he got into this issue of childhood obesity because of his heart trouble, and he worked on how do you get these kids to stop having so much soda. And I said to him, this seems like the paradigm case for government action. You have the most well-connected corporations. entering public schools, our schools, using their lobbying power to prevent regulation of it. Kids cannot vote to block it, so they have no remedy. They can't sue to block it. We know these kids have obesity at alarming rates, particularly in certain communities. We know that that shortens their lives by a lot. Like, isn't this the clearest cut? Why didn't, like, he worked with the companies on this. I was like, why didn't you build a movement around this? Why didn't you get a law passed? Why don't we just get all of those drinks out of all of those schools? That's what we would have done in the New Deal. That's what Lyndon Johnson, like, why? And he said something to me that just took the wind out of me. He said, well, it's always better if you can make things work just in the private sector and not involve the government. And he said, the thing is, you got to innovate. We innovated smaller cans because, the company still has to have a business model. And I thought, you were the former president of the United States. Who says the company still has to have a business model? Why is that your problem or my problem? Let them figure out their business model. Let's just stop killing the kids. And if that is not a clear-cut case in our day and age from someone who once marshaled the full power of the United States government, it tells you not about him. It tells you how much our culture has changed. So what could he have done? Build those movements. And what can the rest of us do? I think my simple answer is, because there is this, in an ideal world, I think there'd be less billions laying around for rich people to allocate by their whims. But we're in the world we are in now. And so what do you do if you're in that position? I think the simple answer, and this is a complex issue, but my simple answer would be to shift your giving from giving back to giving up, and from crowding government out to crowding it in. So just a word on each. Giving back is keeping the system that you're standing on top of. It's keeping unequal public schools. It's keeping a world in which women have no maternity leave, but it's throwing some scraps. It's telling women to lean in here and there. It's building that one charter school. It's essentially solving the problem just enough to have to not solve it. Giving up would be solving some of these problems in a way that hurts you. I would love to see a movement of billionaires. I'd love to see a billionaire giving $1 billion donation to an organization trying to figure out how to crack down on global tax havens. That'd be giving up, right? I don't see a lot of that. I don't see that foundation.
There's some, but not a lot. I mean, there's not that. That's a great example. Warren Buffett is advocating for higher taxes, but you are right. There is not much.
$1 billion to out where the money is?
$1 billion.
To bribe some Swiss officials, to leak something. I mean, like, you could do some real...
Yep.
If they're able to do what they've done on AIDS, like, they could do some real work on this issue.
Yep.
And then from lastly, from crowding government out to crowding in, instead of creating your own private thing with your own name on it, you're on the board, you run it, like, center the communities you're helping. And mainstream what you figure out privately through experimentation, mainstream it into government. Head Start started as the Rockefellers innovating in the University of Iowa Child Welfare Station, figuring out privately how to help kids from disadvantaged environments by improving the environment. But then they didn't keep it in a little program in the University of Iowa. They mainstreamed it into the U.S. government. Business people love scale. You know what has a lot of scale? The government. The first class of Head Start had 500,000 children, right? One of whom is a character in the book, Darren Walker, who's the head of the Ford Foundation today, and would not have had that role and wouldn't be one of the leaders of social justice in the world today had that program had 500 students in Iowa instead of 500,000 around the country.
It's fascinating to me how much your answer is the alternative is politics. Right, it's building small d democratic movements that can pass laws that increase taxes and increase public education. I think. Tell me if you disagree.
But one thing, the easy pushback is that, well, we got Paul Ryan. Congress is dysfunctional. You know how many government entities we have in the U.S.? 89,000. Okay, the House and Senate are 2 of them.
Right.
The White House is a 3rd. You don't feel you can influence those 3? Okay, that's fair. You got 89,000 others. Not enough of us run for local things. Not enough of us seek to influence local things. I mean, one simple example of this is this issue of dynamic scheduling for working class Americans is one of the horrors of working class Americans' lives. Schedules changing every week. Having to drop your kids at daycare at 3 a.m. because a company now says you have to come at 5 a.m. instead of 7. It happened. This is something that you talk to any working class community. This is like a big, big issue. You don't need the federal government to fix this. Any city can require 1 month notice to change people's schedules. Any city. Do you know how few cities have done that? Cities totally run by liberals.
How many cities have done it?
Like very few.
Yeah.
Philadelphia's considering it now. So part of this is you can't just keep blaming Republicans in Congress because there's a lot, like New York City is like a liberal paradise. and it's also a paradise of inequality. One of the things we have to reckon with is the neglect of regular people in American life is a bipartisan consensus.
Yeah. And I completely agree with your point about local politics. It's also the case that the House has elections every 2 years, and a lot of Americans don't vote. And it seems to me, if there is one silver lining to the current political, I hope it's a mini era that we're living through, correct, it's the re-engagement of people in life. And as I was reading your book, I was thinking about just how much
it's happening, and it didn't need my book to make it happen. I mean, I think I actually feel a lot of hope these days, because I think Donald Trump has so exposed, and we got quite a long time without saying him. Donald Trump has so exposed the stupidity and bankruptcy of fake change by billionaires pretending to fight for the common good, that I actually think there's a reasonable chance that what follows Donald Trump is not just some other president, but a new age of reform in American life, much like we had 100 years ago, where we actually work to repair the core social infrastructure of this society over a generation, and we stop waiting for trickle-down change.
Okay. Thank you. So we want to go to you all. We've got 2 microphones. My goal is not to have questions only from men, since I've done panels before and that sometimes happens, and you've just had to listen to 2 men drone on for the last. So please use the microphones. And we've got one here that is empty and waiting, and let's get started.
Your mention of Monsanto right off the bat brought me back to a volunteer gig I did at the local NPR station a few years ago, in which Melinda Gates happened to be in the studio, and she's waxing enthusiastic about these sacred seeds and these righteous seeds. And instead of drilling down on that, Diane Rehm throws one softball question to her after another, asking her about how she met Bill, without drilling down on this effort by the Gates Foundation to bribe these leaders in Africa to impose this neo-colonial form of agriculture.
So I just want to make sure we get to everybody. So let's just do a short, one-sentence question.
So that causes cancer. So I'm just wondering what your take is on the Gates Foundation.
The thing I'll just say on that is I think one of the sort of things we haven't talked about today is actually the media's role in giving people a pass. I think if you run an aggressive fund, the media goes after you relentlessly. If you want to help people, it's just a very different tone of peace. But in my view, because helping people also involves an exertion of power over them and involves, in my view, a potentially anti-democratic, one person, a million votes, the media should just be far more critical of that. We should treat it the way we treat any other exertion of power.
Yeah.
All right, speaking for the women in the room. So first of all, I'm just thrilled that you wrote this book, and particularly the last part on crowding government in and government as scale. It's exactly right. But let's forget the billionaires who are starting social enterprise, and let's instead think about the number of people who used to go to law school, go to business school, but then do set up a civic organization or a social enterprise. They don't have a lot of money. They join the rest of us in begging for money from rich people. But why aren't they a thick civil society that we deeply need in addition to government? So I want you to address those people.
Absolutely.
And why that isn't a good thing.
And I think of those people, when I say government, I think of those people as being government adjacent and being part of an infrastructure that holds government accountable, files lawsuits. I mean, on the education issue I mentioned of unequal public school funding, it's organizations exactly like that that are actually leading some farming, potentially, hopefully, some Supreme Court cases one day, which I hope reaches the wonderful judge we have in the back there from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, because I know he's a compassionate man. And, I think one of the things that people in those spaces tell me, and often privately for obvious reasons, they are the people who come up as activists, who come up as civil society people. But as you say, to raise money, they have to, and they tell me horror stories about, if I get money from this billionaire, I can't use the word inequality in any of my tweets. I have to switch to opportunity. This is real. right? If I want money from this thing, I can't work on the tax issue. I mean, I heard someone was an arts organization that raises money, but they can't like raise the issue of taxation in their arts programming. That was one like rich person's condition for donating to the arts, right? And so my issue is not with those organizations. I think those people are doing the Lord's work. I think an interesting remedy for that would be, I think we could get much more creative about that charitable tax deduction. I think we should only give it to you if your donation is public spirited. And there's a couple things that I think would make it public spirited. If your name's on it, not public spirited. You're buying a plaque, no deduction. If you're sitting on the board of the initiative and you get to decide how it goes, no deduction. You're purchasing the right to like govern people. Do it, but no deduction. If on the other hand you are donating to things in a way that put those activists in charge, or put the public authorities in charge, or let a library system make its own decisions, then maybe we give you because you are essentially contributing to public goods.
I hear that. It makes me think we should just get rid of the deduction.
I think it would not be a terrible idea. All of you work harder and longer hours to pay for billionaires to get a tax deduction for their donations. Seriously. 60-something billion dollars a year.
I'm another white dude, sorry. I did want to return, which I think is a really crucial question, the points you were making about culture and language, and also the notion that the sort of organized beggaring of our political economy is a bipartisan project. All of that, in my mind, raises the question of ideology. And, what I think in anyone watching, the current calamity here and who's been paying attention to...
Which calamity? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, not the weather one.
So let's just do a short question.
Yeah, right. There's a pattern whereby right-wing ideologues get into power.
I'm sorry.
No, I know.
I just want to do like a one-sentence question. Like literally just like a one sentence, because I just want to make sure we get to a lot of people.
Okay.
What's the one-sentence question?
There's an anti-government ideology on the right. There's a neoliberal capitalist ideology that enables the destruction of the idea of governing on the right. And what value do you see in describing, the liberal side of this problem as, an ideology?
Let me just say this. I think one of the interesting things in the book is that sometimes people are a little bit puzzled by is like, why isn't this a book about the Koch brothers? And in part because Jane Mayer wrote that book and it's really good and you should all read it, called Dark Money. And I don't go wherever Jane Mayer goes. But I think my book is the second half of a two-piece puzzle. The first, and in some ways the originator of this struggle, was a 30-40-year war initiated from the political right and business interests to frontally wage war on government, make us all think government's the enemy, and the Koch brothers kind of personify that, right? This book is not about that, although Jane Mayer's book's a great book about that. This book is about people generally on the other half of the aisle, but not always, who were not trying to do that, who were actually trying to help, sometimes a little cynically, but often in real ways, who ended up being the enablers of that war on government continuing. And this is a story about enablement, and that's where the neoliberal thing comes in. I think it is meaningfully different from the Koch brothers, who intended to create the outcome they created. I think the people I'm writing about actually didn't intend to create the things you started with in terms of what's happened to the average worker in America, but ended up enabling it in ways that they couldn't anticipate and perhaps didn't mean to.
I might add that, and even when some of those efforts actually did good, those people were not joining the fundamental battle over the future of this country.
Correct.
They were sort of off to the side.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Hello. Yeah, I think what you're raising is extremely important, and historically speaking, if we go back to the Roosevelt era, we can see all that work out the same way. Okay, so my point is...
So let's just do a simple question, because I just want to make sure we're being fair to everybody.
Not everything's that simple.
Well, but if you don't have a question, then we'll move on.
Yeah, but if you keep interrupting, then it even makes it even longer. Okay.
Just do a quick question, just because I want to be polite to the folks behind you.
So what I'm getting at is that this is human nature. It's in all of us to some degree. We're all protective. How do we start to move forward in terms of intellectually getting ourselves focused on where we have to go instead of always, and I'm not complaining, but always making this a people problem, because we've got to get beyond what is really human nature.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here today. So this book resonated with me with an experience I had over the summer. So over the summer, I taught a social enterprise course at Stanford University for high school students, and they were really wealthy students. And part of the program was for them to design a social enterprise that solved the problem. Overwhelmingly, the students chose issues that were outside of their realm of experience. For example, I had a student who wanted to solve food stamps, and her solution was to create a blue apron for food stamp providers. And I had, there were international students. Another group of students.
Why do I never hear these examples while I'm still writing the books?
They wanted to solve immigration in Spain and Italy. They were a group of Spanish and Italian students, and their solution was to basically redistribute immigrants to the rest of Europe, because that was their big concern.
So to deport them.
Yes, essentially. Yeah. So I'm curious to know what you would suggest for the generation coming after us who strongly believe solving social problems is their responsibility and are essentially growing up to become the elite hijacking social changers that you talk about in your book.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I actually think your question gives us a path forward to the whole consulting finance pipeline question, which is, it sounds like you're making a case implicitly for those students doing something other than going into consulting and finance after they graduate. They should go have weird, crazy experiences in the world that put them into other people's communities and actually educate them about what you don't learn in college, right? And they should actually go do jobs that the kinds of like normal job, like, I mean, I don't know, just like go run a hamburger joint in China, right? Like people, I mean, some people do that kind of thing after college, but like people with the best options generally don't. I just personally think that people should go have weird and experiences that actually anchor you in community, because these sound like the kind of ideas people have when they actually don't know anything about other people.
Hello, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
And I have two questions.
Let's do one and then we'll rotate.
Okay.
So pick your best one.
Okay.
In a Darwinian fashion.
Okay. I work in education in Egypt, and there are some programs being implemented in Egypt that I am running, and this made me like, am I doing something bad for this country, which is the USA, because these programs are really working against and pushing against the power dynamics in my community back in Egypt. But obviously, they're supporting, according to your argument, these people, this elite here. So this made me question: should I stop?
Why is it supporting the elite here? I don't understand.
Because they are the people who are responsible for these programs.
The people funding your program
Yeah.
in Egypt.
Yeah.
Got it.
Which is good in Egypt, but bad here.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. A lot of people ask that. I mean, I think, a take that's different from mine that a lot of people point out is like, look, if some of these American billionaires who've made money on the world for a while, like funneling their money back to these countries, great. And I think there is a difference when some of this money is going to other countries, and like there is a justice component to that money flow, but I'm concerned about the power dynamic again. Like, do these people get to decide how you do your program in Egypt? Do they get to decide who's good and who's bad, who gets the money, who doesn't? Are they on the board? That power, like, what does the money buy them? Are they just helping, or are they running, right? And so that's one question. It's often how you do something, and not just like, do I do it or not?
Thank you so much, Anand, for your book. Even though you say that you focus a lot of it on the United States, in fact, many of the issues you raise are quite broad. I've worked on gender equality for 40 years now in global context, primarily in the global South, and many of the same kinds of patterns you see there as well. I would ask you one question. I think that when you classify corporates or that sector, government and civil society, for example, which is often done as these big entities, I would argue that what I've seen anyway is that the same kinds of frames that you're talking about operate in all three circles. And those are the ones who are at Aspen, those are the ones who are at the Clinton Global Initiative, those are the ones who are at the State of the World Forum kind of stuff. And so, and what I've seen is that there is a tendency in this kind of corporate giving and in the kinds of work that all three do to focus on the individual and to focus on individual change, what you call change at the margins.
Right.
And,
So let me-
and not to focus on any kind of structural change. The reason why those kinds of organizations are not on the campuses is because they are being defunded.
Correct.
In large.
So I think you're exactly right. So a couple things. One, I think you are right that what I'm describing here is really the privatization of social change and kind of philanthropic efforts and those kind of things. But the story I'm not telling in this book, but that's a very important story, is the same thing happened to government, right? Corporations, and that was the kind of Koch brothers thing we talked about. But like companies run government as well. And so one of the critiques that you could throw back at me is, well, you're saying solve more problems in the government, but the government's totally captured. And my argument is, yeah, it absolutely is. And we need to make that not the case. And that may be 50 years of work, but I think it's the work. So yes, those dynamics do exist in government, but there's one difference with government. At the end of the day, however corrupt or captured it is, government speaks in all of our name in a way that no company does, even when it's corrupt. Right? It still speaks in our name because that's just a matter of philosophy. It's just it speaks for the whole, and so to me, it's a lot more important to clean that up because that we own in common. I end the book by talking to an Italian political philosopher. You should always end a book that way. Chiara Cordelli at the University of Chicago, and there's a scene where she's sitting on a panel with Sandy Weil, who used to run Citigroup. Didn't believe in government when he was at Citigroup, hence financial crisis, and then doesn't believe in government now that he's a philanthropist because he can solve problems better. And he kept saying how great he is at solving problems, and how government's so bad, government's so bad, government's so bad. And this like Italian political philosopher just looks at him after a while and says, "The government is us." And he looked at her like, "What?" She said, "The government is us." And he said, "What?" "The government is us." Even when your family is dysfunctional, you don't go to Thanksgiving in a restaurant by yourself. You fix your family. You fix the dinner. You stay and you make it better. And that's what we have to do with our government, regardless of how corrupt and captured it is. I hope you don't do that at Thanksgiving.
Hi. Myself and some other friends of mine were a little surprised with Bill Gates being at the top of your blurbs. And I understand that you had a kind of a evaluation questionnaire thing that you went over with different foundations and different of the private. That's what Lynn told me. Anyway,
Lynn
Dolnick.
No, not. I just interviewed people at various foundations. Yeah.
So, well, I was going to ask you what was your sort of key or instrument that you used, but I also want to give a shout out to, and sort of on the other end of the spectrum, ask you your experience with organizations, smaller budgets that have direct contacts with community organizations. The Lobby Fund of Haiti is in the house. The Global Fund for Women is in the house. The Global Fund for Children, yes, and I'm sure a bunch of others, but that's just who I happen to see. If you could give us an example of what you've seen that you go like, this is the way it should be.
I mean, one organization that I love that's probably similar to the ones you mentioned is the National Domestic Workers Alliance, right? I mean, and iGen was another one of my blurbers, and I want to talk about the Gates thing in a second because it's a funny story. But she is not living in a silo. Like, she raises money from, I think, the Ford family. I mean, she raises like the big money. And I to be honest, I don't know exactly how she does it, but she has protected her work from the pressure. I don't know how structurally she did it, and I'd be curious, and maybe some of these organizations have done the same thing. The same way newspapers actually are able to like raise advertising revenues and not have Piaget determine what the news coverage is. I think there actually are organizations that raise money that manage to protect their work from rich donors, and we should probably all study them. And she's one who's absolutely thinking about the future of work in ways that are not win-win, in ways that will involve sacrifice.
It's a great case study in how important norms are.
Correct.
Right? That's how the media does it. It's about norms.
Correct.
It's about
and no one would think to ask.
No one would think to ask, or when they do, they're laughed out of the room.
I mean, I think Arthur Jr. today made an announcement in the New York Times that they were working on like a Harvey Weinstein advertising deal when the story broke, and they were like, we don't care, like that, and no one in the ad team knew, and they just ran the story. Like that's the kind of ethic that I think actually a lot of these organizations, some do have, and more could have. The Gates thing was funny. I actually had a fear, which probably every author has, but with this book, it was particularly strong. I really thought no one was going to blurb this book, and so I decided to pursue two tracks. One was I sent it to people who I thought would be sympathetic, like iGen. And then I made a list of people who I thought would reject it. And my plan was we're going to have like 4 blurbs on the back that were all rejection letters. Lloyd Blankfein is unable to read this book. Office of Lloyd Blankfein. Just like 4 of those. And I thought that was gonna be so good. My agent was like very nervous. I still think it may have been better. And Bill Gates was the only one where I thought it could go either way. So I did him first. And it's a parsed, nuanced blurb. I mean, it's not directly necessarily about the book. It's a complicated relation to the book in there. But he did it. And I think one of the things that I've been told by people who work for him is that he actually, and I think there are legitimate issues around the amount of power he has as an individual, no matter how good the work is, but he doesn't like all these finance people who give like $1 million to a gala and try to pass themselves off as being the same as him. And that he kind of wanted to, draw a little bit of a line between people who pursue transformational change and people who don't. That's what I heard.
Thank you. Last question.
Yeah, close us out.
I'll close us out. You do not have to close us out.
So you talked a lot about the private sector and the government and how reforming the government is going to be a long process. What role do you see nonprofits and philanthropy in that? Do you see them as an interim role? Because you criticized Aspen, but you also praised the Rockefeller Foundation for initiating Head Start.
That's a great question. And so it goes to that thing I said before, which is, in an ideal world, there'd be less money to give away, because more of that would have been paid out as wages, more of that would be in public schools, more of that would be, in people's, I was just looking at the numbers today. I think the 99% of Americans, the bottom 99%, are still 30% poorer than they were in 2007, the financial crisis. The top 1% of Americans are like 30% richer. I mean, this is stuff you know so well. So in an ideal world, that wouldn't be the case, and we would have done different policies to make that not the case, and there'd be less money to give away. But in the world we are now, I think the transitional moment, and it's going to be a long transitional moment. Right. This is not going to happen before Gates' fortune's gone, and maybe not before all of Zuck's fortune's gone, if he ever really gives it away to his LLC. Is for them to give better, and for them to give in ways that, so I talked about that giving back versus giving up, and crowding out versus crowding in. A simpler way to say it is, I think for that generation of people, and there really is a new generation that will be interesting. Bezos still hasn't decided how he's going to do it. Zuck and the others, is if they, let's imagine, I don't have that much hope for them, but let's imagine, what would it look like for them to give as traitors to their class? Because actually the people who can most afford to be traitors of their class are people with like $100 billion, right? Let's just think about what that giving would look like, right? I mean, someone in Chevy Chase may not be able to afford to fight for equal public schools for everybody. But Elon Musk can afford to fight for that, right? And actually, it would be amazing if some of those people would commit to giving in ways that actually erode the very unfair platform that they're standing on top of, right? And do the things that actually a corrupt, captured government can't do right now. Do the things that, actually use their power to play and experiment and work outside the system, but then bring it into the system and make the system better for everybody, solve problems at the root and for all.
great closing question. I want to end, of course, by thanking Anand. It's wonderful. Congratulations. I want to thank all of you for coming out. And I also just want to say a thanks to Politics and Prose. I, like many of you, am a regular customer of this bookstore. None of us being here tonight or sitting here helps them pay the bills or pay the electricity or pay their workers. So if you're able, and they didn't ask me to say this, please buy a book on your way out. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.